So it's not D&D D20, but it feels like D&D D20. It's Splunge. What's up, Internet? Jay here with Nerd Rage Against the Machine. Today we're going to talk about Star Trek, the role-playing game by Decipher. This is the second to most recent version of the Star Trek role-playing game. It was produced by Decipher and used their Coda system. And as you can see, it's 2 volumes. It's a player's guide, narrator's guide, and they make kind of a cool little cover together like that. But before we get too far into this, I want to really kind of delve into the history of the design here, because it's, I think, an important factor of this game. So a little bit about the history of the Star Trek RPG at this point. The previous edition was produced by Last Unicorn Games using their Icon system, and they'd produced 3 of the 4 RPGs they'd promised. 1 for Star Trek Classic, 1 for TNG, and 1 for Deep Space Nine. A 4th Voyager game never came out, and there was really no plans beyond that other than supplements and things. But they were bought out by Wizards of the Coast. Now, Wizards of the Coast stated they wanted the company for its massive pool of talent and to have a presence on the West Coast, I believe. And I'm going to call bunk right there because, well, let's take a look at their assets. They would have had, of course, offices and furniture, which Wizards could have was big enough, being owned by Hasbro, that they could have found some offices out there. If they really wanted. As far as writing talent goes, it's not hard to either poach somebody or even, hire them as a contractor for a single project. Now, other than Star Trek and Dune, which I'll get to in a second, the only other assets that they had was a game called Aria. Aria was a fantasy RPG based on world building. It was kind of a complex world building system. Well, Wizards could have, again, scummy as this may sound, they could have easily crib-noted very similar things and put it into D&D, taken the aspects they liked of the game and added it to their already popular D&D game. And honestly, Wizards at this point had made it clear that they weren't doing anything that wasn't D20. They had already canceled Alternity, and they'd canceled the Marvel Saga RPG and a couple others that were decently selling but weren't D20. D20 was what they were doing. That's it. End of discussion. D20 or bust. So it doesn't really strike me that they would have just bought this group for their amazing talent, which they then got rid of. Now, as for the Dune RPG, Wizards did release the Dune RPG in a super limited run using the Coda system because, again, Last Unicorn was that close to done with it. It was like either at the printers or, finalizing the beat of the printers when the deal went through. So for one Gen Con, you could buy the Dune RPG and that was it. No supplements, nothing else, and they had talked briefly about releasing a D20 version of Dune. And I think that was really what Wizards' plan would have been to own Star Trek. I mean, as far as licenses go, Star Wars, Star Trek, and Dune, that's a pretty good field to own right there, don't you think? Unfortunately for Wizards, the Herbert Estate and Paramount pulled the licenses. And we wouldn't see a Dune RPG until recently, until the release of the new movie and Modiphius' version of Dune, which I did already do a review about. I'll leave a link below. As for Star Trek, it went to Decipher. Now, Decipher was home of the Star Trek collectible card game, as well as several other collectible card games. And they decided that they were going to hire most of that Last Unicorn team and, at that point, get into the RPG industry. Dip their toes in, as it were. And that's the first thing that's kind of a red flag here. And I'm going to say this because Decipher was a CCG company. And honestly, role-playing games are a completely alien animal. I mean, if you think about something like Magic as a good example, $10, $20 to get a set of cards. but you're also hooked. It's a higher profit product when done right. You start with a cheap pack of cards, but then you're buying boosters after boosters. New sets come out, and they can resell that same set to you again and again and again. With a role-playing game, honestly, for the most part, one book is all you actually need. Now, I know people who have, libraries of whatever their favorite game system is. I have half a bookshelf of Traveller, or I have half a bookshelf of Call of Cthulhu, or, an entire room dedicated to RuneQuest. Yeah, sure, I don't doubt that. But in this case, all you absolutely need to, say, play D&D is those 3 core books, or a starter set, depending upon how far you intend to get your campaign going. And not every player needs one, so that's another thing that's going to slow that profit. Well, that being said, though, they at least gave it the old college try. Now, the other weird thing here is, of course, as the Last Unicorn team did not have the rights to their icon engine that they used for the previous edition, they had to come up with a new system. And that's the other red flag. This system is what they call the Coda System. They also used it for Lord of the Rings, which they also produced. The system itself, the easiest way to describe it is it is in line with D20. It is very much like D20, but it uses 2d6 instead of a d20. So, whereas this game uses nothing but d6s, it has stats that give you modifiers, it has skills that add to it, then you roll 2d6 versus the difficulty number. You have classes, you have levels. It really does feel like a d20 RPG, but with different dice. And honestly, this is the reason that I would say that this is my least favorite of all the Star Trek RPGs. The production values are decent. Most of it is, again, photography like the previous editions, save for a few. And there is a little bit of art, but mostly it's photography. In fact, and other than the fact that I have all the Star Trek RPGs as a brag, this is the other reason I won't get rid of it, is my copy is signed by George Takei. But honestly, this is the edition I'm least likely to want to play or run. It feels disjointed. Classes and levels really don't work well with Star Trek, in my opinion. The character sheet is also very garish, but that's a very minor thing. And the game didn't last super long. There was, I think, a total of 6 books plus a GM screen. It's a decent game for what it is, but do understand what you're getting into. If you like the D&D mentality, this might be your ideal Star Trek. I don't, so it's not. One thing I will say of interest, having read the Lord of the Rings RPG, I thought it was interesting how they had used the same system, but they did at least change the names of stats and saving throws and things to make them work in Star Trek over Lord of the Rings and vice versa. Decipher has since, I believe, folded. I don't know of their existence currently, even as a CCG company. But at this point, after this game was released, we had kind of a drought on Star Trek RPGs. And while this was still pretty easy to find, and I think even today it's not super expensive or hard to find, nor is the Icon Last Unicorn editions. But it would take a while before we would see another Star Trek RPG come on the horizon. But I would say I'm going to give it a 3 out of 5. Mechanically, like I said, it's accessible. It works, but I mean, I would much rather run any of the other versions. Fossa, Heritage, Last Unicorn, and Modiphius. So having said that, not much else to say except for live long and prosper. I bid you adieu and happy gaming.